He paid for every candle, every flower, every drop of champagne, and his son still looked him in the eye and said, "You can leave now." The room froze. Laughter died mid-air. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs as his son wrapped an arm around his wife's mother and called her the only parent who matters. Cameras flashed while he sat there erased from his own bloodline. But what no one knew was that Robert wasn't done, not by a long shot. Subscribe for more revenge stories like this one, and comment where you're watching from before the truth explodes in the next part. Robert's hand was still on the back of his chair when a voice sliced through the silence. It wasn't his son's or the smug laughter of the guests, it was Claire's. The daughter-in-law, who had barely spoken all evening, stood trembling, clutching the microphone like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes were wet but steady as she said, "The real father is the one who was always there, the man you just told to leave." The air fractured. Glasses stopped mid-air, forks froze halfway to mouths. Every head turned toward her, then toward Robert. For a long heartbeat, no one breathed. His son's face flushed red, the kind of red that comes from shock and fear mixing together. Claire's voice didn't shake again. She went on softer, but clearer than before. "You all clap for a man who forgot what love looks like. But I remember who fixed our first house's roof in the middle of a storm. I remember who drove 3 hours through the snow when my car broke down and your husband wouldn't answer the phone. That's a father." The crowd began to murmur. A few guests set down their drinks. Robert's son David tried to snatch the microphone, but Claire pulled back. "You think money makes you a man? You think pretending to be better than the man who raised you makes you strong? You're a coward, David, and you've just proven it in front of everyone." Her voice cracked on the last word, but the damage was done. The guests weren't smiling anymore. Robert didn't move. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, the pounding in his chest slowing into something deeper, something like calm. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. The humiliation that was meant to crush him had turned into a weapon he hadn't needed to lift. Claire had done what he couldn't. She had spoken his truth. David finally grabbed the microphone, his voice a brittle laugh. "She's emotional. Ignore her." But no one was ignoring her. Even the band had stopped pretending to tune their instruments. A man near the front muttered, "That's messed up, man." Someone else whispered, "Poor guy." The word poor didn't sting this time. It sounded like pity for David, not him. Robert straightened his back. He wasn't angry anymore. He felt something far colder clarity. The woman his son had tried to control was now standing in front of 100 witnesses, turning his arrogance into ash. Robert watched David stumble through a nervous smile, his charm unraveling like a cheap ribbon. He'd built his reputation on the illusion of control, and now control was slipping right through his manicured fingers. Claire's hand was shaking as she set the microphone down. For a second she looked at Robert. There was apology in her eyes, but also something else, respect. He gave her the slightest nod, the kind a man gives when words would only cheapen the moment. The host tried to recover the mood, clapping awkwardly and saying, "Let's, move on to the cake." But no one moved. Robert turned toward the door. The humiliation that had once felt like chains now felt like armor. He walked past the table slowly, each step echoing through the heavy silence. A woman near the exit whispered, "That was his son." Another answered softly, "Yes." And that was his daughter-in-law, who just saved his dignity. Outside, the night air hit his face like a baptism. Cold, clean, real. He could still hear the muffled noise of the banquet hall behind him, the faint hum of whispers that would spread through that town by morning. He didn't care. For the first time in years, Robert wasn't defined by his son's approval. The betrayal had burned something out of him, and what remained was unbreakable. He got into his truck, the same old Ford he'd driven for decades, the one his son used to complain smelled like oil and pine. He sat there with his hands on the wheel, the echoes of Claire's words replaying in his head. The real father is the one who was always there. Always there. He had been. Every scraped knee, every school project, every phone call that came too late at night. He'd been there when no one else was. Maybe that's what hurt the most, being erased by the very person you'd built your life around. Robert started the engine but didn't drive. He just sat there watching his reflection in the windshield, the lines on his face sharper under the streetlight. For years he'd mistaken silence for peace. He thought staying quiet would keep the family intact. But silence hadn't protected anything. It had only given others the freedom to rewrite him out of his own story. Back inside the hall, the whispers were turning into arguments. Through the glass doors he saw David's wife standing alone, her shoulders squared even as guests avoided her. She looked out into the parking lot searching for him, but he didn't wave. Not yet. Some truths needed to sink in before they could mean something. Robert finally pulled out of the lot. The night road stretched ahead, long and empty. The hum of the tires against asphalt sounded almost like applause, the quiet kind that comes after a performance no one saw coming. He passed the diner where he and David used to eat pancakes after Sunday Mass. It was closed now, a flickering neon sign buzzing in the dark. Funny how time closed everything, even memories. He turned on the radio. A blues song filled the cab, low and rough like gravel underfoot. He let it play. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel old. He felt alive, scarred, bruised, but alive. Claire had cracked something open tonight. Beneath the years of humiliation, beneath the layers of patience and pain, there was still fire left in him. By the time he reached his driveway, the sun was beginning to hint at the horizon. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat there in the growing light. The house looked smaller than he remembered. The paint had peeled a little. The porch light flickered. But it was his. No one could take that away. Not anymore. Inside, he poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared. It was Claire. "I'm sorry for what happened tonight. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. He's not who I thought he was." Robert stared at the screen, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. He typed back, "You were braver than both of us tonight. Thank you." He hit send and set the phone down beside the cup. Outside, the first light of dawn washed over the yard. The birds began to stir. Robert breathed in the bitter scent of coffee mingling with the chill of morning. The shame that once sat heavy on his chest had shifted into something lighter. He'd lost a son in that banquet hall, but maybe he'd gained something rarer, his own voice. And yet somewhere deep inside he knew this wasn't the end. Claire's defiance had started a storm, one that would reach far beyond that night. David wouldn't let this go quietly. The truth had a price, and Robert was ready to pay it. What he didn't know yet was how far that truth would reach, or who else would fall when the next secret surfaced. The night was colder than it should have been for early spring, the kind of cold that seeps through fabric and bone. Robert's breath trailed in the air like smoke as he walked down the dim street, his footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. The echo felt almost alive, mocking, hollow, familiar. He passed the glowing storefronts one by one, watching strangers laughing through the glass. They had no idea that somewhere inside him something had just cracked clean in two. Every step pulled another memory loose. The night shifts at the steel mill when his back screamed from the weight. The years of saving for that boy's education, the beat-up Ford he'd sold just so his son could have a newer car. The birthday parties where he'd stood behind the camera instead of in front of it. Sacrifices that used to mean love now replayed like evidence in a trial he didn't know he was on. He had built everything around one belief that respect would grow naturally like ivy around a home. But tonight proved that some roots only strangle what they cling to. He reached a street corner where the wind tunneled through the building, sharp and mean. His coat wasn't enough. The laughter from the party still rang in his ears, but now it sounded distant, tinny, unreal. He crossed the road slowly, passing a flickering streetlight that buzzed like a dying insect. Somewhere behind him a bus hissed to a stop, its doors opening with a mechanical sigh. Robert kept walking. The idea of sitting still felt unbearable. His hands were numb by the time he reached the park. The grass glistened under the weak glow of the lamps. He sat on a bench that groaned under his weight, metal biting through his slacks. He looked up at the skyline, the city bleeding light into the black sky, and wondered when everything had shifted. At what moment had his son stopped seeing him as a father and started seeing him as a burden? He couldn't name it. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it had been happening inch by inch, a slow erosion masked by polite phone calls and birthday cards signed without thought. He rubbed his hands together, trying to summon warmth that wouldn't come. A couple walked past, laughing softly, their fingers intertwined. He remembered the last time someone had walked beside him, Caroline, his late wife. She used to say his silence was comforting, that he carried peace like other men carried pride. He almost smiled, but it twisted into something else halfway up his face. If Caroline had been alive tonight, would have broken her heart. She had adored their son beyond reason, blind to his growing arrogance. Robert wondered if that was his fault too, if his patience had raised a man who mistook kindness for weakness. The wind picked up again, lifting the edges of an old newspaper near his feet. A headline screamed about real estate markets, about families buying homes they couldn't afford. Robert stared at it for a long time, the word home cutting sharper than it should. He'd built two in his life, one with his hands, one with his heart. Both had been taken for granted. He rose from the bench and kept walking. The park ended where the street dipped toward the industrial district. He could smell the iron and oil before he saw the factory lights. He used to work here 20 years ago, pulling 12-hour shifts. The security guard at the gate didn't recognize him, just nodded politely as he passed by. Robert stopped at the edge of the lot, staring through the fence at the massive structure he'd helped maintain. Somewhere inside, the machines hummed the same rhythm they always had. The sound was oddly steadying. It reminded him that some things didn't change. Metal still bent under pressure, but it never forgot its shape. Maybe he didn't either. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look to know it was his son. The screen flashed briefly, one unread message. He didn't open it. Whatever apology David had texted wasn't for him, it was for the world watching. His son had learned long ago how to polish guilt into PR. Robert slipped the phone back into his pocket and exhaled slowly. By the time he reached his truck, his legs ached. The old Ford sat beneath a flickering lamp paint dulled windshield smudged with dust. He ran a hand along the hood as if greeting an old friend. The cold metal steadied him. He climbed in, turned the key, and listened as the engine coughed, then roared to life. The dashboard light cast his face in pale blue, highlighting every line time had etched into it. He caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes red, but not from tears. It was something else. Focus. He pulled onto the road, the tires crunching over gravel. The radio came alive with static before settling on an old country song about forgiveness. He turned it off. Forgiveness felt like a luxury he couldn't afford right now. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was deliberate. As the city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, Robert felt the weight on his chest shift. The humiliation hadn't vanished, but it was changing shape, hardening into resolve. The words Claire had spoken at that party echoed again. The real father is the one who is always there. Always there. He gripped the wheel tighter. He'd been there for everyone, his wife, his son, even those who looked down on him. But he hadn't been there for himself. Not once. The truck climbed a steep hill that overlooked the city. From the top, the lights looked like fireflies scattered across a dark field. He stopped there, engine idling, and watched them flicker. Somewhere down there, his son was probably spinning a story, twisting the night into something convenient. But for the first time, Robert didn't care. The truth didn't need an audience. It only needed time. He sat there for a long while, letting the heater hum until his thoughts began to quiet. When he finally spoke, his own voice startled him. If he's brave enough to throw me away, then I'll be brave enough to face what I've ignored. The words hung in the air, simple and unpolished, but they felt right. He'd been avoiding the truth for years, that love without respect is just a leash. He turned off the ignition and looked at the envelope sitting on the passenger seat. Inside were documents, old financial papers Carolyn had hidden away before she died. He'd found them a few months ago but hadn't had the heart to read them. Now he understood why she'd kept them locked. Maybe she'd seen what he refused to see. Maybe this was where the real story began. The city glimmered below like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Robert leaned back, the cold leather creaking under him, and closed his eyes for a moment. The humiliation was gone, replaced by something sharper and quieter, a hunger for truth. What lay inside that envelope might burn every illusion left standing. But after tonight, he wasn't afraid of the fire anymore. When he finally drove away, the lights in his rearview mirror looked smaller, weaker, fading behind him like memories that no longer had power. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in years, Robert didn't mind the dark. Because somewhere in that darkness, the truth was waiting, and he was finally ready to find it. The memory came back to him like an old wound, reopening, quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Robert remembered the smell of wet concrete and steel dust, the sting of sunburn on his neck, the way his hands used to bleed under the weight of a shovel. Those were the years that built him, the years he believed he was building something solid, a home, a family, a future. He'd come home from the construction site long after sunset, boots caked in mud, back aching, but still with a small pride in his chest because he was doing it for them, for Evelyn, for their boy. Evelyn had been beautiful in a way that made people stare when she entered a room. Her hair always done, her clothes always perfect, even when money was tight. But her beauty had sharp edges. She liked things polished, controlled, predictable. Robert was none of those things. He worked with his hands. He came home smelling like the world she wanted to rise above. And though she never said it outright, he could feel it, the shame she carried, not of him exactly, but of what he represented. The struggle, the grit, the noise of life lived too close to the ground. In those early years, when their son Daniel was still small enough to crawl into his lap, Robert thought love could outlast resentment. He'd sit with Daniel on the porch, teaching him how to whittle wood, how to measure twice and cut once, how to fix something instead of throwing it away. Evelyn would watch from the window, arms crossed, shaking her head. "You're spoiling him," she'd say later. "He needs to toughen up. Life isn't about carving toys out of wood." Robert would laugh softly, thinking she didn't mean it. But over time her words grew heavier, colder, carving lines into both of them. He started noticing how Daniel began to mimic her tone, her phrasing. The way he'd roll his eyes when Robert offered advice, the way he flinched from affection, embarrassed by it. Once, when Daniel was 12, Robert came to his baseball game straight from the job site, still in his work boots, his shirt stained with sweat and dust. The other dads were in clean polos and sunglasses, leaning against their shiny trucks. Evelyn sat with them, immaculate as always, pretending not to see him. When Daniel hit the winning run, Robert jumped up, cheering louder than anyone. His boy looked right at him, then turned away, walking toward Evelyn instead. That night, Robert sat alone on the back steps, listening to crickets and the low hum of traffic. Evelyn opened the screen door, her silhouette framed by the kitchen light. "You embarrass him," she said simply, her voice flat. "He's growing up. You should act like it." She went back inside the door, clicking shut like a final word. He stared into the dark for a long time, the pride in his chest replaced by something sour. He didn't know it then, but that was the first crack, the moment he started losing both of them without realizing it. Years passed in slow erosion. Robert worked harder, took overtime shifts, fixed every broken thing in that house while his family slipped further out of reach. Evelyn filled their weekends with dinners, events, friends who smiled at him too politely. He wasn't one of them. They were people who talked about investments, vacations, stocks, words that tasted foreign in his mouth. He'd sit quietly while Evelyn charmed the room and Daniel watched her do it. That's how he learned power, not from kindness, not from patience, but from control. When Daniel entered high school, he stopped asking Robert for help. Evelyn handled everything: his schedule, his clothes, his college prep, his friends. Robert was the wallet, the ride, the afterthought. Once he overheard Daniel on the phone telling a friend, "My mom's the smart one. My dad just builds stuff." The words landed like nails being driven into old wood. That night, Robert worked in the garage long after midnight, hammering aimlessly just to hear something break the silence. Evelyn died younger than anyone expected. A stroke, sudden and cruel. Robert remembered standing by her hospital bed, staring at the tubes, the pale skin, the stillness that didn't fit her. She looked smaller than she'd ever allowed herself to be. Daniel stood beside him, jaw tight, unreadable. At the funeral, people told Robert how lucky Evelyn had been to have such a strong family, such a devoted husband. He nodded, thanked them, accepted their empty kindness. Inside, he felt hollow. He knew better. Evelyn hadn't been lucky she'd been in control until the end, and now her control lived on and Daniel carved deep into his bones. After the funeral, Daniel started taking charge of everything: bank accounts, property, even the house Robert still lived in. "It's just easier if I manage things," Daniel said. "You shouldn't worry about it, Dad." Robert wanted to argue, but the words died on his tongue. Arguing felt useless. He had spent decades avoiding conflict for the sake of peace, not realizing that silence had raised a man who mistook it for surrender. He could still see it clearly, the way Evelyn used to smile when Daniel repeated her opinions, how she'd touch his shoulder and say, "You'll be someone important one day." That was the legacy she left him. The belief that power meant dominance, that gentleness was weakness. And Robert, in his endless patience, had let that lesson take root. The resentment didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in slowly, quiet and poisonous. Robert would catch himself staring at old photographs, the family vacations where he was always the one behind the camera, the Christmas mornings where Daniel sat closer to Evelyn, the birthdays where he'd left early for work just to pay for the gifts. He'd think about all the times he'd chosen silence, thinking it would earn him love when all it did was teach them how to ignore him. Now, walking through the emptiness of his house years later, he could still hear Evelyn's voice echoing faintly in the walls. "You're too soft, Robert. That boy needs strength." He laughed under his breath, a low, bitter sound. She was wrong. He had strength, the quiet kind that didn't need to shout, the kind that survived humiliation, loneliness, betrayal, the kind that endures long after the applause fades. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the old armchair by the window, watching the wind move through the trees. The moonlight caught the framed photo on the shelf, Evelyn young and fierce, her hand on Daniel's shoulder. The boy's smile was wide and proud. Robert stared at it for a long time, feeling something shift inside him. The resentment wasn't just toward his son anymore. It was toward himself for letting this happen, for believing that love alone could hold a house upright when its foundation was already cracked. He took a slow sip, the burn tracing down his throat, and whispered, "No more." The glass clicked softly against the table. Outside, a car engine roared in the distance, then faded into the night. Robert leaned back, eyes still on the picture. The reflection in the glass distorted their faces, blending Evelyn's pride with Daniel's arrogance. He looked at them and thought almost calmly. The same fire that built this family might be the one that burns it down. He didn't know yet how or when, but the decision had already been made. The time for silence was ending. The truth waiting inside that envelope wasn't just about money or betrayal, it was the root of everything they'd become. And when he opened it, it would change the meaning of every sacrifice he had ever made. Years have a way of dulling sound. In Robert's house, they didn't pass. They accumulated, settling into the corners like dust, muting everything that once made it feel alive. The laughter that used to bounce off the walls was gone, replaced by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the same floorboard near the kitchen he'd meant to fix a dozen times. His son's voice, once bright with curiosity, now came through the phone like static, sharp, detached, and efficient. "You don't need to worry about that, Dad. I've got it handled." Words meant to reassure, somehow always felt like dismissal. It started subtly. A skipped visit here, a delayed return call there, holidays shortened, invitations phrased as obligations. Daniel would say, "You know how busy we are." "Dad, his tone polite but hollow, the same tone Evelyn used when explaining why she couldn't stay for dinner all those years ago. The resemblance was uncanny. Sometimes Robert caught himself waiting for her to appear from another room, arms crossed, finishing her son's sentences with that same thin smile. But she was long gone. It was her voice that survived living comfortably inside their son. At family gatherings, Robert became furniture present but unnecessary. Thanksgiving dinners were the worst. The first few years after Evelyn's death, Daniel insisted on hosting, filling the house with guests from his wife's side of the family. They brought expensive wine designer coats and the faint smell of arrogance. Robert sat at the far end of the table, half listening to conversations about markets, properties, and summer homes he'd never see. He'd try to join in, offer a quiet comment or a joke, but the table swallowed his words before they reached anyone. He started to notice small things. Daniel no longer introduced him as my father. It became Robert. Once, when a guest asked how the family business started, Daniel laughed lightly and said, "Mom's vision mostly. She was the brains." Robert smiled, lifting his glass to hide the tremor in his hand. No one noticed. He didn't correct him. He never did. The silence grew teeth. It bit harder with each visit, each polite exchange. Robert told himself he was giving Daniel space, that this distance was temporary, that his son would one day look back and see everything clearly. But that belief began to rot the longer he held it. Every unanswered message, every missed birthday, every half-hearted "Thanks, Dad," carved something out of him. The old house felt heavier now. Rooms he used to fill with music stayed dark. The piano Evelyn once played sat untouched, its keys yellowed. Sometimes on restless nights, Robert would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the phone. He'd scroll through old photos. Daniel's graduation, their trip to the Grand Canyon. That crooked smile the boy used to have before ambition hardened it. He'd type out a message and delete it. There were no words left that didn't sound like begging. The few friends he had left had stopped calling too. They'd moved away, retired, died, or simply drifted apart. The only constant companion was the low hum of the clock on the wall. It ticked relentlessly, a metronome to his solitude. When the mail came, he'd check it slowly, pretending for a moment that something personal might be waiting. It never was. Daniel visited once every few months, usually unannounced, usually in a hurry. He'd stand near the doorway, still in his suit, his phone always buzzing in his hand. "You doing okay, Dad?" He'd ask, eyes scanning the room instead of his face. Robert would nod, pretending it was enough. Once he asked if Daniel wanted to stay for dinner. His son smiled thinly. "Next time. Claire's waiting." That next time never came. Sometimes Robert wondered if Evelyn would have been proud. She'd wanted Daniel to be strong, decisive, respected. He was all of those things and more. He was efficient, powerful, untouchable. But kindness had vanished somewhere along the way, stripped away like paint under years of rain. Robert had hoped his son's success would feel like redemption for the years of struggle. Instead, it felt like exile. There were nights when he would wake up suddenly, the sound of Evelyn's voice echoing in his dreams, sharp, critical, commanding. "You made him soft," she'd whisper, the same accusation she'd used decades ago. He'd sit in the dark, staring at the faint light seeping through the blinds, wondering if she'd been right after all. Maybe softness had no place in a world like this. Maybe silence had been his greatest mistake. He tried to stay busy, fixed what little needed fixing, mowed the lawn even when it didn't need mowing, volunteered at a local community center where people still called him sir, and thanked him with sincerity. But no matter where he went, the emptiness followed like a shadow. The quiet hours after dusk were the hardest. That was when the memories came thick and vivid, the sound of Daniel's laughter as a boy, the weight of Evelyn's hand on his shoulder, the scent of sawdust and coffee in the mornings. They came uninvited reminders of everything that had slipped through his fingers. One Sunday, Robert drove past Daniel's house telling himself it was just coincidence. Through the wide glass windows, he saw his son and Claire entertaining guests. Their laughter floated into the night, easy and rehearsed. Robert sat in the car for a long time, engine idling, headlights off. He thought about knocking, but what would he say? I was just passing by. No, he wouldn't do that to himself. He turned the car around and drove home, the silence pressing tighter against his chest. In the following weeks, he stopped calling, stopped expecting. The routine of loneliness became a rhythm he understood: wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. People assumed he was fine because he never complained. That was the cruel thing about quiet men, they were too easy to overlook. He found an old notebook one evening while cleaning his desk. Inside were sketches of the house he'd once planned to build, a dream that never left the paper. Thick walls, wide porches, sunlight everywhere. On the last page, in faint pencil, he had written one line: "For Evelyn and Daniel. A place we'll never outgrow." He traced the words with his thumb until they blurred. Somewhere between the ink and the memory, something hardened in him. He looked around his house, every corner filled with ghosts that refused to leave. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy, and he had none left for that. What he felt was deeper, colder, a steady erosion of faith. But underneath that hollow ache, something else was forming. Not hope, not yet. Just a quiet awareness that silence had cost him everything, and it would not protect him again. Outside, the wind carried the first bite of winter. Robert stood by the window, watching the dark swallow the last streaks of light. The reflection staring back at him wasn't a broken man, it was someone emptied out, waiting for something unnamed to return. The years of silence had stripped him bare, but what remained might finally be unshakable. He didn't know it yet, but the stillness he'd mistaken for defeat was about to become the calm before the reckoning. In the weeks after the birthday party, whispers followed the family like smoke after a fire. What Claire had done couldn't be undone. Her words had cut through the air like glass, and though no one dared repeat them in public, the damage was already spreading. Robert heard the aftermath from a distance. A neighbor's awkward pause when she saw him at the store. A coworker's wife stopping mid-greeting, pretending she hadn't recognized him. They all knew something had happened, even if they didn't know what. For years, the Daniels had lived like a portrait, polished, smiling, carefully arranged for display. But the frame had cracked, and no one knew how to hide it. Robert wasn't sure whether to thank Claire or pity her. That kind of truth, once spoken, had a cost. He hadn't heard from her since that night. He didn't expect to. Still, every time his phone buzzed, a flicker of something, not hope exactly, but its quieter cousin, stirred in his chest. When a message finally came, it was short. "We need to talk, not over the phone." They met at a small diner off the highway, the kind of place where the coffee was too strong and the waitresses called you hun. Claire looked different without makeup, younger somehow, but her eyes carried the same exhaustion Robert had seen in his own reflection for years. She didn't bother with small talk. "He's been lying to you," she said. "To everyone." Robert didn't flinch. "I know," he said quietly. "I just don't know how deep it goes." She took a slow breath, glancing around the diner before leaning forward. "Deeper than you think. The house, your savings, even some of your wife's accounts, they've all been moved. Hidden. He's using them for investments under his in-laws' names. Gerald's the one pulling the strings. David just signs the papers." For a moment, Robert didn't speak. The noise of the diner faded, replaced by a low ringing in his ears. He'd suspected something: the late-night calls, the dismissive tone when money came up, the subtle way his son had kept him out of the loop. But hearing it out loud from the woman married into it made his blood run cold. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. Claire's hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee. "Because I thought I married a man with ambition. I didn't realize I'd married a mirror of his mother, cold, calculated, and cruel. He's not just taking from you, Robert. He's taking from everyone. And I can't be part of it anymore." Robert studied her face. There was no performance there, no self-pity, just truth, raw, shaking, but unflinching. He nodded slowly. "Then we stopped pretending," he said. They spent hours talking. Claire showed him screenshots, emails, bank transfers. Each one was a piece of a puzzle he didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. By the time she finished, his coffee had gone cold, and his pulse had settled into something steady, not rage, not disbelief, but purpose. When he left the diner, the evening light had turned the parking lot gold. He stood by his truck for a long time, watching the sun sink behind the gas station sign. The world felt sharper, heavier, more real than it had in years. He wasn't a fool anymore. He wasn't a ghost in his own story. That night back home, he opened the old wooden box on his desk, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside were the documents he'd ignored for too long. Evelyn's will, old property deeds, his marriage certificates, and the thick envelope of financial papers she'd hidden away before she died. He'd never had the stomach to go through them. Now his hands didn't shake when he untied the string. The papers confirmed everything Claire had said, and more. Transfers Evelyn had made quietly, signatures from Gerald's firm, subtle amendments that funneled portions of Robert's assets into trusts controlled by people he didn't even know. She'd started it long before her death. The betrayal had roots deeper than her grave. Robert sat there in the dim light of his study, surrounded by evidence of how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. But instead of despair, he felt something else stirring clarity. He could finally see the architecture of deceit, every hidden beam and crooked nail. And he realized he was the only one who still knew how to tear down a structure without making it collapse on himself. He began making notes, dates, account numbers, the timeline of every lie. He wasn't planning revenge. He was drawing blueprints for justice. Years of construction work had taught him one thing: when a foundation rots, you don't patch it, you rebuild it. The following days moved with quiet precision. He called in favors from old contacts, men who owed him from his days contracting government projects, accountants who remembered his reputation for honesty. He didn't tell them the full story just enough. "I'm looking into something," he'd say. "Need it done discreetly." They didn't ask questions. People trusted Robert maybe more than he deserved. Meanwhile, he kept his interactions with Daniel minimal. When his son called, usually to smooth over public embarrassment after the party, Robert played the part of the weary old man, confused but forgiving. "Don't worry about it," he'd say softly. "These things happen." The same phrase Evelyn used to use when she was lying. Each conversation was a test, and Daniel failed every one. The charm, the control, the way he spoke in complete sentences, designed to end every argument before it began. All of it was his mother, reborn. And yet now that Robert could see it clearly, it didn't hurt the same way. The pain had become a compass pointing him towards something worth doing. One evening, as he reviewed documents under the low hum of a desk lamp, a memory surfaced: Daniel as a child kneeling beside him in the yard, hammering crooked nails into a scrap of wood. "It's okay, Dad," he'd said with a grin. "It's not perfect, but it's mine." Robert had laughed then, proud of the effort. He hadn't realized that one day his son would build something far more dangerous, an empire of deceit, and call it his own. By the end of the week, Robert had everything he needed: proof, leverage, and resolve. But something in him resisted the idea of striking immediately. Not yet. Timing mattered. A building only falls cleanly when you understand its weight. He would wait for the right moment, when the silence around his son would be loud enough for the truth to echo through it. He turned off the light and stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. Across the distance, the night was calm, deceptively calm. Inside that calm, he felt the first pulse of something alive again. Not anger, not vengeance, but justice taking form, slow and certain. Somewhere out there, Claire was doing the same, gathering, preparing, choosing courage over comfort. The thought made him smile faintly. For years, he'd been the only one who saw what this family really was. Now finally, he wasn't alone. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just shatter the illusion his son had built, it would burn down everything that had kept Robert quiet. Because once you've learned how to rebuild from ashes, you stop fearing the fire. The rain had been falling since morning, steady and cold, turning the yard into a mirror of gray water and mud. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and paper, that scent of things forgotten too long. Robert sat at his old desk, the same one he'd built decades ago when he still believed work could fix anything. Folders lay open before him, their edges yellowed, the ink bleeding faintly through the years. He hadn't meant to dig this deep. He'd only wanted to find the deed to the lake house, something practical, something simple. But as the papers spilled across the table, the truth began to surface slow and deliberate like a corpse rising from dark water. He found it in a folder labeled E. Finances. Private. The handwriting was Evelyn's neat and deliberate. His name wasn't on the tab. That alone made his pulse quicken. He opened it carefully, the paper brittle under his fingers. Inside were photocopies, contracts, and account summaries from a trust he'd never seen before. The name at the top of each page was familiar but wrong. Gerald Whitmore and Associates. His son's father-in-law. At first the numbers didn't make sense. Investment portfolios, offshore accounts, transfers to shell corporations in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He wasn't an accountant, but he'd spent his life reading blueprints, and this was just another structure. The pattern was there if you knew how to look. He traced the lines with a trembling finger, the faintest smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. Evelyn had been moving money before she died. Money from their joint savings from the lake house, from his retirement fund. Not large sums at once, but steady, careful withdrawals. It was a slow siphoning spread over years buried beneath charitable donations and investment notes. And all of it led to Gerald, the man who'd looked him in the eye at family dinners and called him old-fashioned. The man who'd once said with a polite smile, "Not everyone's cut out for business, Robert." He sat back his chair, creaking under the weight of it all. The documents spread across his desk like an autopsy of trust. For a long time he didn't move. The clock on the wall ticked with surgical precision, slicing the silence into equal parts disbelief and rage. When he finally stood, it wasn't anger that drove him. It was clarity. He'd spent years thinking Evelyn's distance had been emotional, that her coldness was just exhaustion or pride. But this was deliberate. She'd built a system behind his back, aligning herself with people who saw him as a liability to be managed, not a partner to be respected. He walked to the window, the rain streaking down the glass, distorting the world outside. He thought of Daniel, his son, sitting in Gerald's office, nodding along, pretending to understand finance while being used as a pawn in a game far beyond him. He wasn't the architect of this deception. He was the final brick in a wall Evelyn and her allies had spent decades building. Robert turned back to the desk and began arranging the papers in order. Chronological, logical, indisputable. He highlighted signatures, Evelyn's, Gerald's, and later Daniel's. The three of them connected on paper like a family crest of betrayal. He took notes, writing dates in a notebook, drawing arrows between names and accounts. He wasn't just reading anymore. He was building a case. As night fell, he made coffee strong enough to scrape the rust off his thoughts. The lamp cast a golden circle on the desk, everything outside it falling into shadow. The house creaked occasionally, settling in the cold like it was listening. He didn't notice the hours passing. Each new discovery sharpened him. He found property deeds under shell companies, all tied to Whitmore Holdings. Rental houses, commercial lots, even a vacation condo in Florida that Evelyn had once claimed belonged to a family friend. She'd been funding their empire piece by piece, using his earnings as mortar. Every dollar stolen from his name had gone into fortifying theirs. Robert stopped when he found a line item he almost missed: Clearview Lake Project. Initial investment. The lake house. His lake house. The one he'd built by hand, plank by plank, after Caroline's death to remember her. They'd folded it into an investment scheme without his consent. His throat tightened. For a moment the edges of the room blurred. He reached out, steadying himself on the desk, his knuckles white. He imagined Evelyn sitting there years ago, signing the papers, her expression calm, clinical. She'd probably told herself it was for the family, that Robert wouldn't understand, that he'd just get in the way. She'd always underestimated him that way. When the trembling stopped, he began to smile. Not a happy smile, something leaner, sharper. There was power in the truth, and it was sitting right here in his hands. He could already see how this would play out if he handled it right. Gerald had a reputation to protect. His empire depended on silence. Daniel's wealth and status were built on that same illusion. And illusions crumble fast when someone turns on the lights. He took photos of every document, backing them up to an external drive he'd bought years ago but never used. Then he locked the originals in a metal file box and slid it under the floorboard of his study beneath the loose plank he'd left there from his last repair job. The sound of the wood settling back into place was quiet, satisfying. Robert poured himself another cup of coffee and stared at the reflection of the lamp in the window. For the first time in years, he didn't feel tired. The silence that had once been a burden now felt like armor. He could move unseen, prepare without interference. Let them think he was the same soft old man they'd dismissed. The beauty of being invisible was that no one saw you coming. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky deep and low. The rain began to ease, leaving the streets slick and shining. Robert stood there for a long moment, watching the storm fade. He thought of Claire, her fear, her courage, and knew he couldn't tell her yet. She'd done enough. This next part was his. He picked up one of the contracts again, running his thumb over Evelyn's signature. The ink had faded, but her handwriting was as elegant as ever, deliberate to the end. "You thought you'd built something unbreakable," he murmured. "You forgot who taught you to build in the first place." The house groaned softly, and somewhere in the distance a car door slammed. Robert closed the folder, exhaled slowly, and turned off the lamp. The darkness wrapped around him, quiet but alive. He knew now that he wasn't just holding proof, he was holding the fuse. And when the time came to light it, there would be no turning back. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, like someone reminding the house who was in charge. Robert didn't look up right away. He'd been expecting it. The old clock above the mantel ticked twice before he finally said, "Doors open." The latch clicked and David stepped in like he owned the place. He filled the doorway with the scent of money. Expensive cologne, fresh dry cleaning, leather soles that hadn't walked on dirt in years. "Nice place," David said, glancing around with a smirk. "Didn't realize you still lived here. Thought maybe you'd sold it by now." He was wearing a dark suit that looked tailor-made, the kind men wore to boardrooms and power lunches not to see their fathers. Robert stayed seated at the table, the one covered in the faint scratches of years gone by. His late wife's handwriting still ghosted across an old notepad near the corner. "Coffee?" he asked. "I already had mine." David pulled out a chair but didn't sit. He let his briefcase drop onto the floor with a soft thud. "You said you wanted to talk." "So talk." Robert took his time pouring the coffee, letting the silence stretch thin. The rhythm of it calmed him. He set the cup down and looked at his son. Really looked at him. The hair slicked back the sharp lines of his jaw. The restless eyes that darted toward anything reflective, mirrors glass his own ego. "You remind me of your mother," Robert said finally. David laughed short and dry. "That's supposed to be an insult." "No," Robert said, stirring his coffee once slowly. "Just an observation." David shrugged, adjusting his cufflinks. "Well, at least I took after someone who got things done. You could have learned from her, you know. Instead, you spent your life working with your hands, building things no one remembers. You could have been more." Robert felt the words land, but they didn't wound like they used to. They just confirmed what he already knew. He nodded, once thoughtful. "Maybe. But the things I built still stand." David's smile thinned. "You still don't get it. The world moved on, Dad. Men like you, small, quiet, content to fade away, your fossils. You think hard work and patience mean something they don't. Connections do. Power does." Robert leaned back, his eyes steady. "Is that what you call what you've been doing with Gerald Power?" David stiffened just for a second, the faintest crack in his armor. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Robert's tone didn't change. It didn't need to. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. No theatrics, no folder, no dramatic reveal. Just one page. He slid it across the table. "Your signature," he said quietly. David didn't move to take it. He didn't have to. The color drained from his face, the arrogance faltering before he caught it and reshaped it into something colder. "You've been going through my business." Robert shook his head. "Your mother's. And yours. Turns out they're the same thing." David let out a long breath, then leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous calm. "You have no idea what you're playing with, old man. Gerald doesn't lose. He protects his own. You think you've found something clever, but you don't understand the system. You never did." Robert met his gaze evenly. "You're right. I don't understand how a son takes his father's money, his home, his trust, and hands it over to strangers in exchange for approval." "Approval!" David barked a laugh. "I built everything I have on my own. You didn't give me anything but a lesson in mediocrity. You stayed small because it was safe. I refused to." "You stayed small too," Robert said softly. "You just built yourself a taller box." For a moment the only sound was the clock ticking. The air between them felt heavy, charged. David finally stood straight, pacing the room. His reflection passed across the window, tall and restless, like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "You think you've got some kind of moral high ground here," David said. "You're living off the scraps of a life that passed you by. You could have been someone. But you chose to rot in this house, clinging to your pride like it's worth something." Robert rose slowly, every movement deliberate. His voice when he spoke carried no anger, just clarity. "I chose to keep my name clean. That's worth more than whatever you've sold yours for." David turned, eyes flashing. "You think this self-righteous act means anything? You're weak. Always have been." Robert stepped closer. The distance between them was the width of a lifetime. "No," he said quietly. "I was patient. That's different." David's jaw tightened. He picked up his briefcase, snapping it shut like a final word. "You have no idea what you've started," he said, his voice trembling with fury beneath the polished tone. "If you think you can embarrass me or Gerald or anyone else, don't. You'll regret it." Robert smiled faintly, almost pitying. "I'm too old for regret." David hesitated at the doorway, his reflection caught again in the glass, still for once. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," Robert replied, "but at least it'll be mine." The door closed with a soft click. Robert stood there for a moment, feeling the vibration of it fade through the wood floor. His heart didn't race. His hands didn't shake. The storm had passed, and all that remained was a strange stillness. He walked back to the table and looked at the paper his son hadn't touched. The signature at the bottom glared up at him. Evidence, truth, power. Once that handwriting had made him proud. Now it was just another blueprint of betrayal. Outside, the sky was shifting. The rain had stopped and sunlight cut through the clouds, slicing the room in gold and shadow. Robert picked up the paper and held it to the light, watching the ink gleam faintly. There was something poetic about it, the son who'd thought he'd inherited control from his mother, now bound by the same pride that had destroyed her. He folded the page, carefully slipped it into a plain envelope, and sealed it. His reflection in the window stared back at him, older, lined, but unbroken. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small. He felt precise, measured, the kind of man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He knew David would call Gerald the moment he left. They'd try to intimidate him, to twist the narrative, to make him doubt himself. But that wouldn't work anymore. The old man they'd dismissed had learned the rules, and now he was done playing fair. In the distance, thunder grumbled again, faint far away, but coming back. Robert watched the clouds gather, his reflection merging with the storm's shadow. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "Let's see how strong your empire really is." Then he turned away, the echo of his son's cologne fading into the air, replaced by the smell of rain and the quiet hum of reckoning. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and self-importance. Champagne flowed like liquid gold, laughter rippled through expensive suits, and cameras flashed across the polished marble floor. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala had always been a stage for the powerful to congratulate themselves, a temple of influence where everyone's smiles hid calculations. Robert had been here before, always as an accessory, a shadow at the edge of someone else's spotlight. But tonight, he wasn't part of the backdrop. Tonight, he was the storm they hadn't seen coming. He arrived in a dark suit that still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet where it had hung for years. No driver, no entourage, just himself and a worn leather folder tucked under his arm. His entrance barely drew notice at first. A few guests nodded politely, unsure if they should recognize him. He walked through the crowd with the calm precision of a man who'd already made peace with what came next. Across the room, Gerald Whitmore held court gray hair, perfect cufflinks flashing under the chandelier. His laugh carried just enough authority to make others join in. Beside him, David stood taller than ever, his hand resting on the back of his wife's chair. He looked like a man carved out of success. The perfect son, the perfect heir, the lie incarnate. Robert approached the stage while the evening's host, a man with a permanent grin and a voice made for fundraising, announced the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, a brief acknowledgement before we continue with our donors' awards. A word from one of our long-standing contributors, Mr. Robert Hale. A polite smattering of applause followed, confused but courteous. Robert nodded once to the crowd as he stepped up. The microphone caught a faint hum as he adjusted it. The stage lights felt warm against his face, but his hands were steady. "Thank you," he began. His voice was quiet but carried easily in the hush that followed. "I won't take much of your time. I know how valuable that is in this room." A few chuckles, polite but uneasy. He waited for the last one to fade before continuing. "For years I believed that if you worked hard and stayed honest, the world would sort itself out. That decency would be recognized in time. I was wrong." He let the words hang there, not bitter but measured. Some people take decency as permission. They mistake patience for weakness. They build their kingdoms on other people's silence. From the corner of his eye, he saw Gerald shift in his seat. David's smile had tightened into something brittle. Robert opened the folder. Inside the evidence was neatly arranged contracts, transfers, notarized signatures. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth did the shouting for him. These, he said, holding up a document, are property transfers made under shell companies connected to the Whitmore family's trust. These signatures, he pointed steady, belong to my late wife, Evelyn Hale, my son David Hale, and Mr. Gerald Whitmore. A murmur spread through the audience, the sound of wealth realizing it had just been handed a scandal. Someone near the front whispered, "Is this real?" Another voice answered, "He has evidence." Robert went on, his tone still calm, surgical. "They diverted millions under the guise of charitable investments. Land housing developments, even foundation funds intended for veterans and low-income families, all redirected into private holdings." The host stepped forward, flustered. "Mr. Hale, perhaps this isn't the—" Robert raised a hand, gentle but commanding. "It's exactly the time." The room went silent again. For years I was told to stay quiet, to trust my family, to play the role of the grateful man who didn't understand business. I stayed quiet long enough for them to steal everything I built. But here's the thing about silence, it keeps receipts. Gasps broke through the crowd. Cameras that had been capturing glamorous couples now turned toward the stage. The flashes began again, this time sharp and invasive. David shot to his feet. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice rising above the crowd's murmur. "This is slander." Robert looked at him not with anger, but with something deeper, recognition. "It's called truth," he said simply. "You remember what that is?" Son David's face drained of color. He glanced toward Gerald, who sat frozen, jaw-tight, sweat glistening at his temple. Reporters were already standing, their phones raised, recording everything. Robert turned back to the audience. "You all know Gerald Whitmore as a philanthropist, a man of integrity. I knew him as the man who convinced my wife to funnel money from our family's estate into his empire. And my son, my own son, helped him do it." The last word hit the air like a hammer. Evelyn's name might have carried her legacy into this room once, but now it was the name of a ghost one that had chosen the wrong accomplices. "I have no interest in revenge," Robert continued, "but justice I'll take." A woman near the front gasped as he handed the folder to a man in a gray suit standing by the door. The man nodded, a state investigator Robert had contacted weeks ago. It was done. The silence broke into chaos. Gerald stood abruptly, muttering something to his lawyer. David's wife, pale and shaking, rose from her seat and stepped away from him, eyes wide with disbelief. The guests, who had spent years basking in the Whitmore name, now turned their attention elsewhere, suddenly fascinated by their drinks, their shoes, the exits. The air in the ballroom had shifted. What once smelled of perfume and champagne now reeked of fear. David tried again, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you've done." Robert looked at him one last time. "I know exactly what I've done. I stopped pretending." The applause started hesitantly from somewhere near the back. A single pair of hands, then another, then more. It wasn't loud or unanimous, but it grew awkward and real. Some clapped because they respected courage. Others because they feared they'd been sitting on the wrong side of history. Robert didn't bow. He didn't need to. He stepped down from the stage as calmly as he had walked up, leaving the lights, the whispers, and the wreckage behind him. Outside, the night air was cool, steadying. He loosened his tie, looking up at the sky where the city lights drowned out the stars. For the first time in years, he felt something lift inside him, relief, clean and full. He could already hear the headlines forming, the calls, the panic, the scrambling lawyers. It would be ugly, and it would be public, but it would be honest. As he walked to his truck, the sound of the ballroom doors bursting open echoed faintly behind him. Voices shouting, cameras flashing, his son's world collapsing one flashbulb at a time. Robert didn't turn around. He had no reason to. The truth once spoken didn't need him to defend it anymore. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away slowly. The gala faded in the rearview mirror, a glittering monument to arrogance turned to dust. And in the distance, far beyond the city's glow, the horizon waited quiet, endless, and ready for whatever came next. The morning light slipped through the blinds, in thin, deliberate lines cutting across the old oak desk where Robert sat. The house was silent, stripped of the echoes that once filled it with argument, laughter, and the heavy footsteps of family. It was the kind of silence that no longer hurt. The coffee beside him had gone cold, but he didn't mind. In front of him lay a single sheet of paper that would end everything, not with anger, but with clarity. The lawyer, a kind-eyed man in his 40s, sat across from him. He had offered sympathy more than once, but Robert didn't need it. "You're certain?" the lawyer asked quietly. Robert's pen hovered above the document. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He signed his name slowly, each letter deliberate, his hand steady. The ink bled faintly into the paper, permanent and unshakable, just like the truth he'd finally spoken weeks earlier. When the pen stopped moving, he exhaled and leaned back. "That's that," he said. The lawyer nodded. "Your son will contest this." "I know." Robert smiled faintly. "Let him try. I raised a fighter. He just never learned what's worth fighting for." He slid the papers across the desk. The new will was simple. The house, the savings, the lake property. Everything would go to a foundation he'd quietly registered under the name The Evelyn Project. Not for his wife, but for the kind of people she'd never have helped. It would provide housing and scholarships for abandoned children and single fathers trying to rebuild their lives, for men who worked double shifts and still came home to cold dinners for kids who needed someone to believe in them without condition. The lawyer gathered the papers and stood. "I'll file it immediately." When the door closed behind him, Robert remained seated, listening to the sound of the car pulling away. He looked around the room at the photographs lining the walls. There was one of Evelyn smiling in the sunlight by the lake, her hand on Daniel's shoulder, David's shoulder. He forced himself to use the right name now. The boy she'd molded into something sharp and hollow. He didn't feel hate anymore when he looked at that photo-only distance, the kind that can't be crossed by apologies. Outside, the afternoon wind picked up, shaking the trees. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the window. It reminded him of the nights he used to sit awake, waiting for the sound of his son's car pulling into the driveway, hoping for a visit, a conversation, anything. Those nights were over. Waiting was over. The call came sooner than he expected. A furious voice on the other end, trembling with disbelief. "You think this is funny?" David hissed. "You humiliated me in front of everyone, and now this." You're cutting me out." Robert's tone was calm. "I didn't cut you out, son. You stepped out a long time ago. I made this family what it is," David spat. "You wouldn't even have that house without me. You think anyone's going to see you as some kind of hero? Now you're a joke." Robert didn't respond. He listened to the sound of his son's rage unraveling a storm collapsing on itself. When David realized his words weren't landing, he hung up. The silence that followed felt like closure. Hours later, Robert heard the gravel crunch outside. The door flew open before he could reach it. David stormed in, red-faced, his suit disheveled. "You don't get to do this," he shouted. "You don't get to take away what's mine." Robert stood by the doorway, unflinching. "It was never yours," he said. "You ungrateful David," started his voice cracking. "I spent years protecting your name, your reputation, and this is how you repay me." Robert looked at him. Really looked. The arrogance, the entitlement, the desperation barely hidden beneath the surface. He saw not a man, but the shadow of a boy who had once believed that love was measured in control. "You didn't protect me," Robert said softly. "You erased me." David's hands clenched into fists. "You're throwing everything away for strangers. For people who still know what loyalty means," Robert said. "For people who don't mistake love for ownership." David's voice broke into a low growl. "You're pathetic." Robert took a step forward close enough for David to feel the weight of his calm. "You told me to leave your life," he said, his voice steady. "Now you'll have to live without mine." The words hit harder than any yell could have. David froze, his face twitching between fury and disbelief. For a moment the mask of control slipped, revealing something raw beneath it, a flicker of shame, maybe even fear. But pride swallowed it quickly. He turned, grabbing his jacket from the chair, muttering under his breath. "You'll regret this," he said. "I already have," Robert replied. The door slammed. The house shook, and then it was still again. The echo of his son's footsteps faded down the path, leaving only the hum of the evening air. Robert walked to the window and watched as the car tore out of the driveway, its tires spitting gravel. The dust lingered long after the vehicle was gone. He stood there for a while, letting the silence settle. For the first time, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space clean, earned alive. That night he sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon and watched the sun sink over the trees. The light fell across the old swing he'd built decades ago for a boy who no longer remembered how to be one. The bourbon burned a little going down, but the warmth that followed wasn't pain. It was peace, slow and steady, the kind that comes after years of holding your breath. In town, word of his decision spread fast. Some called him cruel. Others called him brave. He didn't care what they called him. Legacy wasn't about who inherited your money. It was about who carried your truth. And his truth finally belonged to something good. He thought about the Foundation's first project, a shelter on the east side where the paint peeled and fathers slept in their cars to stay close to their kids. The blueprints were already drawn, the land already donated. He'd make sure it stood strong and honest the way his own house had been before greed crept in. The sky deepened to purple, then black. Crickets began their low chorus. Robert leaned back, feeling the cool air on his face, and let himself breathe. The anger, the humiliation, the grief, they were all behind him now. Quiet ghosts with nothing left to say. Inside, the lawyer's papers sat sealed on the desk. Tomorrow they'd be filed and everything would be official. But tonight that didn't matter. Tonight was his. He looked out at the horizon one last time, the faint glow of the moon catching on the lake in the distance. Somewhere beyond that, the world kept moving loud and relentless. But here in this small corner of it, peace had finally taken root. And as he closed his eyes, the old man who had once been invisible felt at last entirely seen. In the quiet ending of Robert's story lies a truth many older hearts understand too well, that respect cannot be demanded, only earned, and silence, though noble, can sometimes cost us our dignity. His journey reminds us that wisdom isn't weakness, and walking away from betrayal isn't surrender. its strength reclaimed. Life, especially in our later years, isn't about holding on to those who no longer see our worth. It's about standing tall for what's right, even when it means standing alone. Robert chose integrity over inheritance, justice over comfort, and in doing so found peace no wealth could buy. For those who've sacrificed much for family, remember your value doesn't fade with age or go unnoticed because others forget. Dignity once restored is the greatest legacy we can leave behind. If you've ever faced disrespect after a lifetime of giving, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful revenge stories, where justice, wisdom, and courage remind us it's never too late to take back your voice.